What happens when a woman with absolute power builds a house just for herself? Why would a queen pour the nation's treasury into a private retreat when her people were starving? And how can a building meant to be a sanctuary become the very thing that seals a ruler's tragic fate? These are not just stones and mortar. They are the stories of women who shaped nations and then shaped the very earth to create spaces of their own. Number 22. How did a woman erase the men who came before her? Her name was nearly lost to history. Successors chiseled her face from monuments. They tried to erase every carving of the woman who dared to rule as king. She even wore the false beard of the pharaohs. Yet the grandest temple of its time, a place she built for her own worship, survived. It was built into the side of a cliff at Deir el-Bahri in Egypt. The woman was Hatshepsut. She ruled for over 20 years in the 15th century BCE. Her temple was not a tomb. It was a place for her cult, for people to worship her as a living god. Hatshepsut was the daughter of one pharaoh and the wife of another, her half-brother Thutmose II. When he died, the throne was supposed to go to his infant son, Thutmose III, born to a lesser wife. Hatshepsut was named regent. She was supposed to rule only until the boy was old enough, but she had other plans. In the 7th year of her regency, around 1473 BCE, she declared herself pharaoh. This was a radical move. Egypt had a deep tradition of male rulers. To justify it, she claimed the god Amun-Ra had visited her mother in the form of the pharaoh and conceived her. She argued the divine daughter of a god. To prove her legitimacy, she needed more than stories. She needed stone. Her mortuary temple, which she called Djeser-Djeseru, or Holiest of Holies, was her masterpiece of propaganda. It was designed by her chief steward, Senenmut, a man of humble birth who rose to become one of the most powerful people in Egypt. His relationship with the queen was so close that some historians believe they were lovers. He was granted the unprecedented honor of having his own image and name inscribed inside her temple. The temple is unlike anything that came before it. Instead of a massive, imposing pyramid, it is a series of 3 colonnaded terraces rising from the desert floor, perfectly integrated with the sheer limestone cliffs behind it. The effect is elegant and modern. It took about 15 years to complete. The walls of these terraces were covered in detailed, painted reliefs. These were not just decorations, they were her biography, her resume, her legal argument for rule. One series of reliefs tells the story of her divine birth, showing the god Amun-Ra holding her as a baby. Another tells of her greatest achievement, a trading expedition to the land of Punt, a mysterious, wealthy land likely in modern-day Somalia or Eritrea. The carvings show Egyptian ships returning with gold, incense, myrrh trees, and exotic animals. This was proof of her ability to bring prosperity to Egypt. She was showing, not just telling, the people that her reign was a time of peace and wealth. The temple was a busy religious center. It had shrines to several gods, but the main focus was on Hatshepsut and her divine father Amun-Ra. Priests performed daily rituals in her honor. It was a place where her power was made real, a permanent stage for her new role as a male king. She was always depicted in the reliefs with the body of a man and the traditional pharaonic regalia, including the kilt and false beard. The inscriptions use masculine grammar when referring to her. She had to become a man in art to be accepted as a ruler in life. After her death around 1458 BCE, her stepson, Thutmose III, finally took the throne. For 20 years, he did nothing to his stepmother's monuments. But late in his reign, he ordered a systematic destruction of her memory. Her statues were smashed and buried in a pit near the temple. Her name and image were chiseled off walls and replaced with the names of her father, husband, or stepson. The goal was to erase the fact that a woman had ever held the throne, perhaps to ensure his own son's succession would not be challenged by a female relative. For centuries, Hatshepsut was forgotten. It was only in the 19th century that archaeologists began to piece together the fragments and rediscover the story of the female pharaoh. Her temple, though damaged, was too grand to be completely destroyed. It remains her most powerful legacy. Number 21. Could a woman's love build an empire's jewel? This building wasn't for her, it was for her parents, but it was so revolutionary, so perfect in its design, that it became the blueprint for the most famous building in the world, the Taj Mahal. The woman was Nur Jahan, and the tomb she commissioned is known as the tomb of Itimad-ud-Dawla, or the Ababi Taj. She used a material never before seen on a Mughal monument in this way, white marble, and she covered it in a delicate inlay of semi-precious stones, a technique called pietra dura. This structure, completed in 1628, changed the course of imperial architecture forever. Nur Jahan was not born to be an empress. She was born Mehr-un-Nissa in 1577 in Kandahar, what is now Afghanistan. Her family was of Persian nobility but had fallen on hard times. They were traveling to India to seek favor at the Mughal court when she was born. She grew up in the imperial harem and married a Persian soldier. After her husband died, she entered the service of the emperor's harem. It was there, at age 34, that she captivated the Emperor Jahangir. He married her in 1611 and gave her the name Nur Jahan, meaning light of the world. She quickly became more than just a wife. Jahangir was increasingly dependent on alcohol and opium. Nur Jahan became the de facto ruler of the vast Mughal Empire. She was intelligent, politically astute, and a brilliant administrator. She was the only Mughal empress to have coins struck in her own name. She sat in on court proceedings, issued royal orders, and controlled the empire's finances. Her power was absolute. When her father, Mirza Ghiyas Beg, who served as Jahangir's prime minister, died in 1622, Nur Jahan decided to build a tomb for him and her mother. She chose a spot on the banks of the Yamuna River in Agra. This was her personal project, funded from her own resources. She oversaw every aspect of its design and construction. The result was a jewel box of a building. It was the first Mughal tomb to be built entirely of white Makrana marble. The previous tombs, like that of her husband's grandfather, Humayun, were primarily made of red sandstone. The real innovation was the surface decoration. Instead of carved reliefs, the entire exterior is covered in intricate pietra dura work. This involved carving the marble with delicate floral and geometric patterns, and then inlaying precisely cut pieces of carnelian, jasper, lapis lazuli, onyx, and topaz to create a shimmering, mosaic-like surface. It was a Persian aesthetic brought to India and perfected. Inside, the lattice screens, or jalis, are carved from single slabs of marble into impossibly fine lace-like patterns. The effect is one of immense wealth, but also of refined taste and delicacy. The tomb sits in the center of a classic Persian charbagh garden, a four-part paradise garden divided by water channels. The building itself is small and intimate, unlike the grand masculine structures of previous emperors. It reflects a shift in imperial taste, one guided by a powerful woman. It took 6 years to build. The cost was enormous. The tomb of Itimad-ud-Dawla established a new architectural style. Nur Jahan's stepson, Shah Jahan, was deeply influenced by it. When his own beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal, died, he used the baby Taj as his inspiration. He took the white marble, the pietra dura inlay, the garden setting, and the overall sense of ethereal beauty, and expanded them to an unimaginable scale to create the Taj Mahal. Without Nur Jahan's intensely personal tribute to her parents, the world's most famous monument to love might have looked very different. Her power was so great that she not only ruled an empire, but she also defined its aesthetic for generations to come. Number 20, can a palace be built from fear? The main building material was wood. Its central roof was supported by a single, massive rosewood pillar, 120 feet high. From this palace, a queen ruled through terror and isolationism. She maintained her power for 33 years, a reign marked by a brutal campaign against foreign influence and Christians. The palace was the Manjacamiadana in Antananarivo, the capital of Madagascar. The queen was Ranavalona I. Tens of thousands of her own people died carrying out her orders, including the construction and constant rebuilding of her royal compound. Ranavalona was not of royal blood. She was a commoner who was chosen as the first wife of King Radama I because her father had revealed a plot against the king's life. When Radama died in 1828, a group of powerful court officials conspired to put her on the throne, hiding the king's death long enough to eliminate his other potential heirs. Ranavalona seized power and immediately began a reign of reaction against the modernizing policies of her late husband. Radama had welcomed European missionaries, traders, and military advisors. Ranavalona saw them as a threat to traditional Malagasy culture and her own authority. One of her first acts was to fortify the Rova, the royal palace complex that sat on the highest hill in the capital. The centerpiece was the Manjakamiadana, or fine place to rule. Initially, it was a traditional wooden structure, but Ranavalona had grand ambitions. In 1839, she commissioned a French castaway named Jean Laborde to encase the wooden palace in a new stone structure. Laborde had impressed the queen with his ability to manufacture guns, cannons, and gunpowder. Now she put him in charge of her great building project. The construction was a monumental and deadly task. There was no suitable stone near the capital. It had to be quarried miles away and dragged up the hill by hand. The timber for the scaffolding and beams had to be brought from the rainforests on the coast. The process was done by Fanapawana, a system of forced labor that was essentially a form of tax paid with work. Thousands of subjects were conscripted for the project. The labor was so grueling and the conditions so harsh that it's estimated over 10,000 people died during the construction of the stone casing and other Rova buildings. The palace was literally built on the suffering of her people. The finished palace was a strange hybrid. It was a traditional wooden Malagasy royal house with its towering central pillar and steep roof, trapped inside a stern, fortress-like stone shell with classical European-style verandas and windows. It had over 2,000 workers. The palace was a physical representation of Ranavalona's rule and assertion of traditional Malagasy power, but using European techniques to project an image of impregnable strength and modernity on her own terms. Inside, the palace was filled with a mix of local crafts and expensive European furniture, gifts from diplomats who had tried and failed to curry favor with her. Ranavalona used the palace as the stage for her power. She held grand receptions, or cabarets, where she would address her subjects from the balconies. It was from here that she issued the edicts that banned Christianity, expelled foreigners, and implemented the Tangina ordeal, a justice system where guilt or innocence was determined by whether a person survived ingesting a poison nut. It is estimated that this practice alone killed as much as 20 to 50% of the population in some areas. Ranavalona I died in 1861. Her successors reopened Madagascar to foreign influence, and the palace was further modified. In 1895, the French colonized Madagascar and abolished the monarchy, turning the Rova into a museum. Tragically, in 1995, a fire swept through the complex, destroying the Manjakamidana and almost all the other original wooden structures within the stone walls. All that was left was the stone shell, a hollow monument to a queen who built her fortress out of fear and the lives of her people. Number 19, what if a seaside villa became a queen's last happy memory? It was built on a stretch of sandy coastline that she loved. She came here for the sea air and the supposed health benefits of the ocean. It was her personal escape, a place of informal parties and relaxation away from the rigid protocol of the imperial court. The villa was called Villa Eugénie in Biarritz, France. The queen was Empress Eugénie, wife of Napoleon III. For her, this palace was not about projecting power, but about creating a private heaven. This heaven, however, would be short-lived. Eugénie de Montijo was a Spanish noblewoman who married Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, in 1853. She was a fashion icon known for her beauty and elegance, but she was also a politically active empress. She served as regent 3 times when her husband was away from the country. She was a devout Catholic and a staunch conservative. Eugénie first visited the Basque coastal town of Biarritz as a child and fell in love with it. After she became empress, she convinced her husband to buy a piece of land overlooking the beach. In 1854, construction began on a summer residence for the imperial family. The architect was Hippolyte Durand. The style was a mix of Second Empire and neoclassical, a large E-shaped building facing the sea. It was not as grand as the Tuileries Palace in Paris, but it was still a substantial and luxurious home. It had around 100 rooms for the imperial couple, their son, and their entourage. The villa was completed in 1855. For the next 15 years, the imperial court would move to Biarritz every summer for 2 months. Life at Villa Eugénie was deliberately informal. The strict etiquette of Paris was relaxed. Guests, who included royalty from across Europe like Queen Victoria and Otto von Bismarck, were encouraged to enjoy the seaside. There were picnics, boat trips, and firework displays. The Empress herself loved to swim in the ocean, a rather daring activity for a woman of her status at the time. The villa was her domain. She chose the decorations, a mix of expensive silks, comfortable furniture, and personal mementos. It was designed for comfort, not just for show. It was a place where she could be a wife and mother away from the constant scrutiny of public life. She established a charitable foundation in Biarritz and took a personal interest in the development of the town, which quickly transformed from a small fishing village into a fashionable international resort, all thanks to her patronage. The idyll ended abruptly. In 1870, France declared war on Prussia. The war was a disaster. Napoleon III was captured at the Battle of Sedan. The Second Empire collapsed and the Third Republic was declared. Empress Eugénie, serving as regent in Paris, was forced to flee for her life. She escaped from the Tuileries Palace with the help of her American dentist and made her way to England, where she was reunited with her husband and son. She would never see Villa Eugénie again. She lived the rest of her long life in exile in England. Her husband died in 1873. Her only son, the Prince Imperial, was killed in 1879 while fighting with the British Army in the Zulu War. It was a devastating blow from which she never truly recovered. The villa in Biarritz was sold by the new French government. In 1880, it was bought by a bank and eventually converted into a luxury hotel, the Hôtel du Palais. It remains one of the most famous hotels in France. Eugénie died in 1920 at the age of 94. The villa she built as a happy summer home became a reminder of a life in a world that had been completely swept away. It was a monument to a lost empire and her own personal tragedies. Number 18 did a poet queen design a fairy tale castle. She filled it with her own art. She designed the stained glass windows, painted murals on the walls, and even helped design the furniture. She was a published poet and novelist, writing under the pen name Carmen Silva. The castle she helped create was Peles Castle in Sinaia, Romania. And the queen was Elizabeth of Wied, the first queen of Romania. She didn't just want a royal residence, she wanted to build a work of art, a home for her nation's new identity. Elizabeth was a German princess who married Carol I of Romania in 1869. At the time, Romania was a young country, having only recently been formed from the union of two principalities. Carol, also a German prince, had been elected to be its ruling prince. In 1881, Romania was declared a kingdom, and they became king and queen. They were tasked with building a modern nation and a royal dynasty from scratch. King Carol first visited the area around Sinaia in the Carpathian Mountains in 1866 and was captivated by the wild, beautiful scenery. It reminded him of his German homeland. He decided to build a summer retreat and royal hunting lodge there. The project began in 1873. The king was in charge of the practical aspects, but Queen Elizabeth was the driving force behind the castle's artistic and aesthetic vision. The architect was Johannes Schultz, but the design was a collaborative effort, with the queen heavily involved. The style is a unique blend of German neo-Renaissance and Gothic revival, with elements of Saxon and Ottoman influences, meant to reflect the cultural crossroads of Romania. It was one of the first buildings in the country to be constructed with a steel frame, and it was revolutionary for its time. From its inception, Peles Castle was fully electrified with its own power plant. It had central heating and a central vacuum system. It had a telephone line. It even had a small elevator. This was unheard of for a castle built in the 1880s. The construction took decades and was incredibly expensive, costing the equivalent of over 120 million of today's dollars, paid for from the king's private fortune. The castle has over 160 rooms, each decorated in a different theme. There is a Florentine room, a Turkish salon, a Moorish hall, and a grand music room. The queen's influence is everywhere. In her personal apartment, she designed wood panels with her favorite poetic verses carved into them. The library, with its secret door, was her sanctuary. The theater, with 60 seats and a royal box, was designed for the performances of plays and musical compositions, many of which were written by the Queen herself. Queen Elizabeth's life was marked by personal tragedy. Her only child, a daughter named Maria, died of scarlet fever in 1874 at the age of 3. The queen never fully recovered from the loss and poured her energy into her artistic and charitable work. She founded hospitals, sponsored artists, and promoted Romanian crafts. Her writing as Carmen Silva gained her international fame. She saw Palace Castle as more than just a home. It was a cradle for Romanian culture, a place to showcase the nation's artistic potential. The castle was finally completed in 1914, the same year King Carol I died. Queen Elizabeth died 2 years later. The castle was used by the Romanian royal family until the monarchy was abolished by the communist government in 1947. The communists seized the property and eventually turned it into a museum. After the Romanian Revolution of 1989, the castle was returned to the former royal family, but it remains open to the public. It is a fairy tale castle, but it is also the product of a queen's artistic ambition and her deep desire to create a cultural heart for her new kingdom. Number 17, could a queen find happiness in a farmhouse? She called it her simple farmstead. It had a thatched roof and was designed to look like a rustic country house. But inside it was filled with elegant neoclassical furniture, fine silks, and masterpieces of art. This was Peretz Palace, a small country house near Potsdam, Germany. It was the personal sanctuary of Queen Louise of Prussia. For her, this was not a place to be a queen, but a place to be a person, a wife, and a mother, away from the stiff formality of the Berlin court. Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz married the future King Frederick William III of Prussia in 1793. She was celebrated for her beauty, charm, and grace. The Prussian people adored her, but Louise found the court in Berlin oppressive. She longed for a simpler, more private life. In 1797, her husband, then the crown prince, bought the small estate of Peretz. He commissioned the architect David Gilly to remodel the existing manor house. The queen was intimately involved in the design process. She didn't want a grand palace, she wanted a home. The result was a building that was deliberately modest on the outside. It was a long, two-story building, painted in a simple white and yellow, that looked more like a large farmhouse than a royal residence. The style became known as Peretzer Stil, a simple, rural version of German neoclassicism. Inside, however, the palace was a masterpiece of refined elegance. The rooms were relatively small and intimate. The most famous feature was the wallpaper. The queen had a passion for interior design, and she chose wallpapers with delicate floral, bird, and landscape motifs. The garden room was papered with a panoramic scene of the Bosphorus. The queen's salon had a paper printed with lilac blossoms. The furniture was light and graceful, designed by the famous architect Karl Friedrich Schinkel. It was the height of sophisticated taste, but it was also comfortable and livable. From 1797 to 1805, the royal family spent every summer at Peretz. It was their escape. Here they could live like a normal, wealthy country family. They went for long walks, had picnics, and worked in the garden. The queen would play with her children and read. The king, an amateur farmer, would inspect the crops. They received few official visitors. The famous Peretz tapestry room features wallpaper printed to look like a straw bale wall, a whimsical nod to the rustic setting. It was an idealized version of country life, a carefully constructed fantasy of simplicity. This happy period came to a sudden and brutal end. In 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte defeated the Prussian army at the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt. The royal family was forced to flee Berlin and live in exile in East Prussia. Queen Louise became a symbol of Prussian resistance and national pride. She famously met with Napoleon to plead for better terms for her defeated country, an act of great personal courage. The family was eventually able to return to Berlin, but they never went back to Peretz for their summer retreat. The memories were too painful. The queen's health, broken by the years of war and exile, failed. She died in 1810 at the age of just 34. Her death devastated her husband and the entire nation. She became a martyr and a national icon. Peretz Palace was left untouched, preserved exactly as it was when the family left. It became a private memorial to the queen and the happy years they had spent there. After World War II, it fell into disrepair under East German rule. But after the reunification of Germany, it was meticulously restored. Today, it is a museum, a perfectly preserved time capsule of the private life of a beloved queen, a testament to her search for a small piece of normal life in the midst of royal duty. Number 16, how did a mother of 16 reshape an empire's capital? She had 16 children. She fought wars to keep her throne. She reformed her empire's army, economy, and education system. And in between all of this, she transformed a humble hunting lodge into one of the most magnificent palaces in Europe. The palace was Schönbrunn in Vienna. The empress was Maria Theresa of the Habsburg dynasty. For her, the palace was not just a home, it was the vibrant center of her sprawling empire and the backdrop for her powerful role as the matriarch of Europe. Maria Theresa was not supposed to rule. Her father, Emperor Charles VI, had no male heirs. He spent years convincing the other European powers to accept the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, a decree that would allow his daughter to inherit the Habsburg lands. When he died in 1740, his promises were immediately broken. Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded the rich province of Silesia, sparking the War of the Austrian Succession. The young 23-year-old Archduchess had to fight for her inheritance. She proved to be a formidable ruler. She rallied her troops, secured the loyalty of the Hungarians, and managed to hold her empire together. After the war, she embarked on a series of ambitious reforms. She also turned her attention to Schönbrunn. The site had been a royal hunting lodge, which was gifted to her as a wedding present. She decided to make it the official summer residence of the imperial court. Starting in the 1740s, she began a massive renovation and expansion project under the direction of the architect Nicolaus Picasso. She wanted a palace to rival Versailles. The result was a colossal 1,441-room Rococo masterpiece painted in a distinctive yellow color that became known as Maria Theresa Yellow. The Empress took a keen personal interest in every detail of the decoration. The interiors were a lavish confection of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, intricate stucco work, and priceless tapestries. The palace was designed to be both a family home and a political stage. The East Wing housed her private apartments and those of her many children. One of the most famous rooms is the Millions Room, paneled with precious rosewood and decorated with priceless miniatures from India and Persia. Another is the Hall of Mirrors, where a 6-year-old Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart performed for the Empress. The West Wing contained the state apartments for formal receptions and ceremonies. The Great Gallery, a 40-meter-long ballroom, was the glittering heart of court life. But Schönbrunn was more than just the building. Maria Theresa also oversaw the creation of the spectacular gardens. The French-style formal gardens were laid out with meticulous precision, featuring fountains, statues, and a maze. At the top of the hill overlooking the palace, she had the Gloriette built, a massive triumphal arch, to celebrate her victory in the 7 Years' War. She also founded the Schönbrunn Zoo in 1752, which is today the oldest continuously operating zoo in the world. And she established the Palace Theatre, where plays and operas were performed for the court. After her beloved husband, Francis I, died in 1765, Maria Theresa's attitude towards the palace changed. She was consumed by grief. She had several rooms redecorated in a somber style as memorials to him. The Violac room was paneled in black lacquer and filled with his portraits. Schönbrunn, the site of so many happy family memories, became a place of mourning. Maria Theresa died in 1780. She had secured her dynasty, reformed her empire, and left behind a cultural and architectural legacy that defined Vienna. Schönbrunn Palace was her creation. It was the home where she raised the children who would become kings and queens across Europe, including Marie Antoinette of France. It was the powerhouse from which she ruled her diverse lands. It was a reflection of her own complex character, a devoted mother, and a powerful empress, a lover of art, and a shrewd politician. Number 15, did a queen recreate her childhood in a foreign land? She was born in Italy and became the Queen of Spain. She hated the grim, formal Spanish court and the imposing royal palace in Madrid. So she had her husband build her a new one, a miniature Versailles set in the mountains, a place that reminded her of the palaces of her youth in Italy and France. The palace is the royal palace of La Granja de San Ildefonso. The queen was Elizabeth Farnese, the second wife of King Philip V of Spain. This palace was her escape, her personal project, and the tool she used to dominate her melancholic husband in Spanish politics for decades. Elizabeth was the heir to the Duchy of Parma in Italy. In 1714, she was married by proxy to Philip V of Spain. And Philip was the grandson of Louis XIV of France and had a deep-seated depression. His first wife had recently died, and his advisors, particularly the powerful Princess des Ursins, were looking for a new queen who would be meek and controllable. They chose Elizabeth. They made a serious miscalculation. The moment Elizabeth arrived in Spain, she asserted her authority. She had the Princess des Ursins, the woman who had arranged her marriage, immediately dismissed and exiled. She quickly established total control over her husband. She was ambitious, intelligent, and politically ruthless. For the next 30 years, her primary foreign policy goal was to secure Italian thrones for her own sons, since Philip's sons from his first marriage were in line for the Spanish throne. Philip V disliked Madrid and longed to abdicate the throne. In 1720, he bought the site of La Granja, which had been a hunting lodge and monastic farm. He intended to build a modest retirement home, but under Elizabeth's influence, the project grew into a magnificent Baroque palace. The design by Italian architects was heavily influenced by Versailles, where Philip had grown up, and by Italian palace design, which Elizabeth knew well. The palace itself is elegant, but the real star of La Granja is the gardens. Elizabeth and Philip poured a fortune into creating one of the most spectacular formal gardens in Europe. They cover over 1,500 acres. The mountainous terrain provided a unique challenge and opportunity. The steep slopes allowed for dramatic water features. A complex system of pipes and reservoirs was built to feed a series of 26 monumental fountains. These fountains are not just decorative, they are elaborate allegorical sculptures depicting scenes from Greek mythology. The Baths of Diana fountain alone has a cascade that shoots water over 40 meters into the air. The cost of building and maintaining this water system was astronomical. La Granja became the Queen's power base. The court moved there for long periods. Here, away from the established political factions in Madrid, Elizabeth could control access to the king and dictate policy. She filled the palace with art, including a massive collection of classical sculptures she brought from Rome. She hosted lavish parties and theatrical performances. It was a bubble of Italian and French culture in the heart of Spain. In 1724, Philip V did abdicate in favor of his eldest son, Louis I. He and Elizabeth retired to La Granja. But Louis died of smallpox after only 7 months on the throne. Philip was forced to become king again. Elizabeth was back at the center of power. She continued to use La Granja as her preferred residence and political headquarters. After Philip V died in 1746, his son from his first marriage, Ferdinand VI, became king. Elizabeth's influence ended abruptly. She was exiled from the court and forced to live at La Granja. The palace she had built as a seat of power became her gilded cage. She spent the last 20 years of her life there, far from the politics she had once dominated. The palace and its magnificent gardens remain a monument to her ambition and her nostalgia for a home she had left behind. Number 14 was a palace built from a queen's grief and superstition. She was told by an astrologer that she would die near the royal palace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. So she decided to build a new palace for herself, far from that ominous place. The palace was the Tuileries Palace in Paris. The queen was Catherine de' Medici. She began construction in 1564, a few years after the death of her husband, King Henry II. It became her obsession, a project she would pour her fortune and energy into for decades, but one she would ultimately abandon out of fear. And Catherine de' Medici, a member of the powerful Italian banking family, was married to the future King of France at the age of 14. For years she was overshadowed by her husband's powerful mistress, Diane de Poitiers. But when Henry II was killed in a jousting accident in 1559, Catherine, as queen mother to her frail young son, King Francis II, suddenly found herself at the center of French politics. She would remain there for the next 30 years, ruling as regent and as the power behind the throne for 3 of her sons. Her time as ruler coincided with the brutal French wars of religion between Catholics and Protestant Huguenots. Catherine was a master of political maneuvering, but she was also deeply superstitious. She surrounded herself with astrologers and soothsayers, including the famous Nostradamus. Her decision to build the Tuileries was driven by both practical and personal reasons. She wanted a modern residence in Paris, away from the old, cramped Louvre. And she wanted to escape the prophecy of her death. She bought a piece of land just west of the Louvre that had been occupied by tile-making factories, or Tuileries, hence the name. She commissioned the architect Philibert Delorme to design a magnificent Renaissance palace. The initial design was for a large central pavilion with long wings extending to the north and south. Catherine was heavily influenced by the Italian architecture of her childhood in Florence. She wanted a palace with grand galleries, elegant apartments, and, most importantly, extensive gardens. Construction began on the south wing and the central pavilion. Catherine took a daily interest in the project, often visiting the site to inspect the progress. She also commissioned the landscape architect Bernard de Carnesse to create a vast Italian Renaissance-style garden next to the palace. The Tuileries garden was a marvel of its time, with fountains, a grotto, a menagerie, and perfectly symmetrical flower beds. It became the setting for Catherine's famous court festivals, lavish spectacles of music, dance, and fireworks designed to project an image of royal power and unity during a time of civil war. The project was plagued by problems. It was incredibly expensive, and the royal finances were constantly strained by war. The architect Delorme died in 1570 and was replaced by Jean Ballant, but the biggest obstacle was Catherine's own superstition. Her personal astrologer Cosimo Ruggieri reportedly told her that she would die near Saint-Germain. Catherine interpreted this to mean the palace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, but later she became terrified that it referred to the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, which was very close to her new Tuileries palace and the Louvre. In 1572, just before the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, an event she is heavily implicated in, she abruptly abandoned the Tuileries project. She moved to a new residence she had built nearby, the Hotel de la Reine, and never lived in the palace she had spent so much time and money on. The Tuileries remained unfinished for years. Later kings, including Henry IV and Louis XIV, would expand the palace, eventually connecting it to the Louvre to create a single, massive complex. It became the main royal residence in Paris. Napoleon used it as his official residence. The Tuileries Palace stood for over 300 years as a symbol of French royalty and power. But its history ended in fire. In 1871, during the suppression of the Paris Commune, the palace was deliberately set on fire and completely destroyed. The ruins were eventually demolished. Today, only the Tuileries Garden remains, a public park stretching from the Louvre to the Place de la Concorde. It is the last remnant of the Grand Palace, a queen built to escape her fate, only to abandon it because of a whispered prophecy. Number 13, How Did a Mother Build? A monument to her son's power. He was the king, but she was the one who held the real influence in the early years of his reign. She was his regent, his chief advisor, and his most loyal supporter. To celebrate her son's accession to the throne, she commissioned a radical new addition to a royal castle, a masterpiece of the French Renaissance that would showcase his modern, sophisticated taste. The castle was the Château de Blois. The woman was Louise of Savoy, mother of King Francis I of France. Louise of Savoy was a formidable figure. She was married at age 11 and widowed at 19. She dedicated her life to the education and advancement of her two children, Francis and Marguerite. She ensured they received a humanist education, immersing them in Italian art and literature. When her son Francis became king in 1515, Louise became one of the most powerful women in Europe. She served as regent twice while Francis was away on military campaigns and was a skilled diplomat and politician in her own right. The royal Château de Blois was a patchwork of architectural styles, with wings built in the medieval, Gothic, and early Renaissance periods. When Francis came to the throne, he and his mother decided to add a new wing that would serve as the main entrance and royal apartments. While Francis was the king, Louise was the driving force behind the project, overseeing the finances and the design. Construction on the Francis I wing began around 1515. The new wing was a declaration of a new era. It completely broke with the old Gothic style of the rest of the castle. It was a purely French Renaissance design, though heavily influenced by Italian ideas that Louise and Francis admired. The most famous and revolutionary feature is the external spiral staircase. Set in an octagonal tower, the staircase is open to the courtyard, supported by ornate pillars and balconies. It was a theatrical piece of architecture designed to be seen. Courtiers and visitors could watch the king and his entourage ascend and descend, turning a simple movement into a public spectacle. The facade of the wing is decorated with intricate carvings, including the salamander, the personal emblem of Francis I, and the ermine and knotted cord, symbols of his wife, Queen Claude. The initials F for Francis and L for Louise are also subtly worked into the decoration. The wing housed the king's new library and his private apartments, or loggias, which were designed with open galleries overlooking the town, another feature borrowed from Italian palaces. The project was a way for Louise to cement her son's legacy and her own influence. It was a physical representation of the cultural shift that Francis's reign represented. He was a great patron of the arts, inviting artists like Leonardo da Vinci to France. His new wing at Blois was a statement of his power, wealth, and sophisticated taste. And his mother was the one who made it happen. Louise of Savoy died in 1531. The wing she helped create remains one of the greatest treasures of French Renaissance architecture. The Château de Blois tells the story of French history in its stones. The grim medieval fortress, the flamboyant Gothic chapel, and the severe classical wing of a later king all stand together. But it is the Francis I wing with its magnificent external staircase that captures the spirit of a new age, an age shaped by a king of legendary style and the powerful mother who guided him. Number 12, why would a queen give up her throne to live in a Roman palace? She was one of the most educated women of her time. She was the Queen of Sweden, a powerful Protestant nation. Then, at the age of 28, she abdicated her throne, converted to Catholicism, and moved to Rome. There, she created a new court in a lavish palace, becoming a celebrated patron of the arts and sciences. The queen was Christina of Sweden. Her Roman home was the Palazzo Riario, now known as the Palazzo Corsini. For her, this palace was the stage for a new life of intellectual and artistic freedom that she could never have had as a ruling monarch. Christina became Queen of Sweden in 1632 at the age of 6, after her father, the great warrior king Gustavus Adolphus, was killed in battle. She received a rigorous education studying politics, philosophy, languages, and science. She was raised as a prince, not a princess. When she came of age, she proved to be an intelligent but unconventional ruler. She was a major patron of the arts, bringing scholars and artists like René Descartes to her court in Stockholm. But she was also resistant to marriage, refusing to provide an heir to the throne. Secretly, Christina had become drawn to Catholicism, a faith forbidden in staunchly Lutheran Sweden. She also grew tired of the burdens of rule. In 1654, she shocked Europe by abdicating. She left Sweden, formally converted to Catholicism in Brussels, and made her way to Rome, where she was welcomed by the Pope. After several years, in 1659, she settled in the Palazzo Riario in the Trastevere district of Rome. She rented the palace and began to transform it into the center of Roman intellectual life. She established an academy, or salon, that met in her rooms. This group, which would later become the prestigious Accademia dell'Arcadia, included the most important poets, musicians, and thinkers of the day. They would gather to discuss literature, listen to music, and watch plays. Christina filled the palace with her vast and priceless art collection, which she had brought with her from Sweden. It included masterpieces by Titian, Raphael, and Veronese. She also had a huge library of rare books and manuscripts. The palace became a kind of private museum and university. She sponsored musicians like Arcangelo Corelli and Alessandro Scarlatti, who dedicated compositions to her. She protected and supported scientists who were often viewed with suspicion by the church. Her life in the Palazzo Riario was not without controversy. She was a woman of strong opinions and often clashed with the papal authorities. Her household was large and expensive to maintain. She was constantly in financial difficulty. But she remained a major figure in Roman society until her death in 1689. She lived in the palace for 30 years. After her death, the palace was eventually bought by the Corsini family in 1736. They had it completely rebuilt in the Grand Baroque style we see today, though it still occupies the same site as Christina's home. It now houses part of the National Gallery of Ancient Art. Christina of Sweden remains a fascinating and enigmatic figure. She gave up a kingdom for her faith and her freedom. The palace she chose in Rome was not just a house. It was her new kingdom, a realm of art, music, and ideas where she could rule not as a queen of a nation, but as a queen of culture. It was the space she created for herself to live the life she truly wanted. Number 11, could a queen's palace spark a civil war? She was a Catholic queen in a Protestant country. She wanted a private chapel where she could practice her faith openly. So she commissioned a new palace on the banks of the River Thames, with a magnificent Roman Catholic chapel at its heart. The palace was Somerset House in London. The queen was Henrietta Maria, the French wife of King Charles I of England. Her very public Catholicism, showcased in this palace, fueled the religious and political tensions that would ultimately lead to the English Civil War. Henrietta Maria was the daughter of King Henry IV of France. She married Charles I in 1625. The marriage was a political alliance, but it also caused immediate problems. As part of the marriage treaty, Henrietta Maria was guaranteed the right to practice her Catholic faith. This was deeply unpopular in England, which was overwhelmingly Protestant and deeply suspicious of popery. The Queen was initially given Denmark House, a Tudor palace on the Strand, as her personal residence. She renamed it Somerset House in honor of its original 16th century builder. The old palace was a sprawling, outdated building. Henrietta Maria decided to completely rebuild a section of it as her modern, private residence. In the 1630s, she commissioned the great architect Inigo Jones, who was a protege of her mother-in-law, Anne of Denmark. Inigo Jones was the man who brought classical Palladian architecture to England. For the Queen, he designed an elegant, restrained building that was revolutionary for its time. It had a clean, symmetrical facade inspired by Italian palaces, a stark contrast to the fussy Jacobean style that was then popular. But the most important and controversial part of the project was the chapel. The Queen wanted a place for her and her Catholic household to worship. Inigo Jones designed a beautiful chapel, consecrated in 1636. It was lavishly decorated in the Baroque style, with a magnificent altarpiece painted by Rubens and a coffered gilded ceiling. To Protestant Londoners, this opulent Catholic chapel in a royal palace was an outrage. It seemed to confirm their worst fears that the Queen was secretly trying to convert the king and the country back to Catholicism. Somerset House became the center of Catholic life at the English court. The Queen hosted masques and plays there, often taking part in the performances herself, which also scandalized the puritanical elements of society. The palace was her personal domain, a bubble of continental Catholic culture in the heart of Protestant London. It became a potent symbol of the religious and cultural divide that was splitting the nation. The king's perceived favoritism towards Catholics, heavily influenced by his wife, was a major cause of the conflict between him and Parliament. When the English Civil War broke out in 1642, Henrietta Maria was forced to flee to France to raise money for the royalist cause. Parliament seized Somerset House. The chapel was stripped of its Catholic decorations. After the execution of Charles I in 1649, the palace was sold off. Henrietta Maria returned to England after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. She moved back into Somerset House and had the chapel restored. She lived there until a few years before her death in 1669. The palace she had built was later demolished and replaced by the current grand neoclassical Somerset House in the late 18th century. Nothing of her building remains except for some foundations and descriptions, but the memory of her chapel and the fear it inspired played a real part in the tragic history of the English Civil War. Number 10. How did a queen build the first truly modern house in England? It looked like nothing else in the country. It was a perfect white cube, a symmetrical classical building that seemed to have been dropped into the English landscape from ancient Rome or Renaissance Italy. This was the Queen's house in Greenwich. The Queen who commissioned it was Anne of Denmark, the wife of King James I of England. With this small but revolutionary building, she introduced a whole new style of architecture that would change the face of Britain. Anne of Denmark was a Danish princess who married James VI of Scotland in 1589. When he inherited the English throne in 1603, becoming James I, she became the Queen of England. Anne was a sophisticated and cultured woman with a passion for the arts, particularly masques, which were elaborate courtly entertainments. She was a major patron, and she wanted a court that could rival the great courts of Europe. The old Tudor Palace of Greenwich was one of the royal family's favorite residences. In 1616, Anne commissioned the architect Inigo Jones to design a new villa for her on the palace grounds. It was intended to be a private retreat and a place to host her glamorous entertainments. Inigo Jones had recently returned from a long trip to Italy, where he had studied the works of the Roman architect Vitruvius and the Renaissance master Andrea Palladio. He was determined to bring this classical style to England. The Queen's House was his first major commission and the first truly classical building in Britain. The design was radical. Instead of the red brick, sprawling asymmetry, and large mullioned windows of Tudor and Jacobean architecture, the Queen's House was a masterpiece of mathematical proportion and harmony. It was built of white painted stucco. The facades were perfectly symmetrical, with clean lines and restrained decoration. The H-shaped plan was designed to bridge a public road connecting Greenwich Park with the palace gardens. Work on the house stopped in 1618 when the Queen became ill. She died in 1619, and the house was still just an empty shell. The project was abandoned for a decade. In 1629, King Charles I gave Greenwich to his wife, Queen Henrietta Maria. She had Inigo Jones resume work on her late mother-in-law's project. The house was finally completed around 1635. The interiors were just as stunning as the exterior. The Great Hall is a perfect 40-foot cube with a black and white marble floor. The tulip stairs are the first centrally unsupported spiral staircase in Britain, a marvel of engineering and design. The Queen's apartments were decorated with magnificent painted ceilings. The Queen's house was Anne of Denmark's vision, even though she never got to see it finished. It was her desire for a modern continental-style villa that gave Inigo Jones the opportunity to introduce his revolutionary ideas. The house set a new standard for English architecture. The Palladian style it pioneered would dominate British country house design for the next 200 years. Today, the old Greenwich Palace is gone, replaced by the Royal Naval College, but the Queen's House still stands, a perfect jewel box of a building. It is a testament to the vision of a queen who wanted to bring a piece of the European Renaissance to her new home, and in doing so, started an architectural revolution. Number 9, what makes a palace? A symbol of a new age. This building was one of the very first in Northern Europe to be built in the new Renaissance style. It was not a fortified castle, but an open, elegant residence for a new kind of ruler, a diplomat and a patron of the arts. The palace is the Hof van Savoye, or Court of Savoy, in Mechelen, Belgium. The woman who built it was Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands. Her palace became the political and cultural heart of the Low Countries, and a model for a new type of architecture. Margaret of Austria had a remarkable life. She was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. At age 3, she was sent to be raised in the French court, betrothed to the future, King Charles VI of France. But he repudiated the engagement to marry someone else. She was then married to the heir to the Spanish throne, but he died within a year. Her third marriage was to the Duke of Savoy, who also died after only 3 years. Widowed at 24, she vowed never to marry again. In 1507, her father appointed her regent of the Habsburg Netherlands, a collection of territories that included modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. She was to govern on behalf of her young nephew, the future Holy Roman Emperor. Charles V. Margaret was an exceptionally skilled ruler. She was a brilliant diplomat, a wise administrator, and a great patron of the arts. She established her court in the city of Mechelen. Around 1507, she decided to expand and completely remodel her existing residence to create a palace worthy of her status. The project took over a decade. She worked closely with the architect Rambert Keldermans. The result was the first Renaissance building in the Low Countries. The rear facade, completed around 1517, is a masterpiece of the new style. It has large, regular windows, classical columns between them, and an open gallery or loggia on the ground floor. This was a radical departure from the dark, defensive Gothic architecture of the time. It was a building designed for light, comfort, and elegant living, not for war. The interior was just as magnificent. Margaret was an avid art collector. Her palace was filled with paintings by artists like Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden. She had a famous library of illuminated manuscripts and was a patron to scholars like Erasmus. The palace was a bustling center of politics and culture. It was here that she raised her nephew Charles and his sisters. It was from here that she negotiated treaties and governed her territories. The Hof van Savoy was a reflection of Margaret herself, sophisticated, cultured, and forward-looking. It was a palace for a new kind of female ruler, one who governed not by military might, but by diplomacy and intelligence. After Margaret's death in 1530, the palace was used as the seat of the Great Council of Mechelen, the highest court in the land. The building was heavily damaged over the centuries, but was restored in the 20th century. Today, it serves as a courthouse. It stands as a monument to a remarkable woman who brought the Renaissance to Northern Europe, in both politics and in stone. Number 8. Why would a queen turn a castle into a university? She inherited the throne at age 10. She was a devout Christian known for her charity and wisdom. Instead of using her wealth to build new palaces for herself, she poured it into restoring her kingdom's most important castle and founding a university within its walls. The castle is Wawel Castle in Krakow. The queen was Jadwiga of Poland. Her legacy was not one of personal luxury, but of education and national pride. Jadwiga was crowned King of Poland in 1384. The title was a way of asserting that she was a monarch in her own right, not just a queen consort. She was the country's last ruler from the Piast dynasty. To secure an alliance with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Polish nobles arranged for her to marry Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. He, converted to Catholicism and became King Ladislaw II Jagiello of Poland. Their marriage created the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a major European power. Jadwiga was a highly respected ruler. She was deeply involved in the political, cultural, and religious life of her kingdom. She was a skilled diplomat mediating disputes between neighboring states. She was also known for her piety and her concern for the poor. Her main architectural legacy is tied to Wawel Castle and the University of Krakow. Wawel Castle, a fortified complex on a hill overlooking the city, was the seat of Polish kings. Jadwiga sponsored extensive renovations to the castle and the adjacent Wawel Cathedral, but her most significant contribution was her support for the university. The University of Krakow had been founded in 1364, but had fallen into decline. Jadwiga understood the importance of education for the future of her kingdom. She petitioned the Pope for permission to establish a faculty of theology, which was granted. She did not live to see her vision fully realized. Jadwiga died in 1399 from complications of childbirth at the age of just 25. Her newborn daughter also died. It was a national tragedy. In her will, she bequeathed her entire personal fortune, including her jewelry and royal regalia, to the university. Her husband, King Jagiello, carried out her wishes. Using the funds she had left, he bought buildings for the university and formally re-established it in 1400. It became known as the Jagiellonian University in honor of the dynasty he and Jadwiga had founded. It is one of the oldest universities in the world and remains one of Poland's most prestigious institutions. Jadwiga did not build a lavish palace for her own pleasure. Instead, she invested in the intellectual and spiritual foundations of her nation. Her renovations at Wawel were for the good of the kingdom, not for her personal comfort. Her enduring monument is not a building of stone, but a living institution of learning that has educated generations of Poles, including figures like Nicholas Copernicus and Pope John Paul II. She was eventually canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, remembered not as a great builder of palaces, but as a wise and selfless queen. Number 7. How can a small room become a queen's entire world? She never ruled a country. She was the Marchioness of a small Italian city-state, but she was one of the most brilliant and influential women of the Renaissance, a master politician and a voracious art collector. She created 2 small private rooms in her castle that became a world-famous sanctuary for art and learning, a space designed entirely for herself. The rooms were the studiolo and the grotta in the ducal palace of Mantua. The woman was Isabella d'Este. Isabella was born in 1474, the daughter of the Duke of Ferrara. She received an exceptional humanist education studying Latin, Greek, music, and dance. At age 16, she married Francesco II Gonzaga, the Marquis of Mantua. While her husband was often away fighting as a mercenary captain, Isabella effectively ruled Mantua. She was a shrewd diplomat and a capable administrator. Her real passion was art. She was one of the most discerning and demanding patrons of her time. She corresponded with all the great artists of the day, including Leonardo da Vinci, Titian, Raphael, and Michelangelo, commissioning works from them. Her goal was to create a collection of art and artifacts that would reflect her intellect and taste. To house this collection, she created a special suite of rooms for herself in the old Castel di San Giorgio, part of the ducal palace. The first room, created around 1490, was the studiolo or little studio. It was a small vaulted room where she would study, read, and write letters. The key feature of the studiolo was a series of allegorical paintings she commissioned from the leading artists of the day, including Andrea Mantegna and Perugino. She gave the artists incredibly detailed instructions on the subject matter, which was based on complex classical myths and humanist philosophy. The paintings were meant to celebrate the triumph of virtue and intellect over vice. Beneath the studiolo, she created a second room, the grotta, or grotto. This room housed her collection of classical antiques, gems, cameos, and other precious objects. The two rooms were connected by a staircase. The studiolo was for intellectual pursuits, the grotta for the appreciation of beauty and craftsmanship. And together they were her private sanctuary, a place where she could retreat from the public duties of the court and immerse herself in the world of art and ideas. Only very special guests were ever allowed to see them. After her husband's death, Isabella moved to a new set of apartments on the ground floor of the palace. She had her entire collection, including the delicate wooden paneling and the paintings from the studiolo, moved to her new rooms. She continued to collect art until her death in 1539. Isabella d'Este's studiolo and grotta were revolutionary. They were among the very first secular private spaces specifically designed to house a curated art collection. They were not about displaying wealth to the public, but about creating a personal environment for intellectual and aesthetic pleasure. The collection was eventually sold off and dispersed. The paintings now hang in the Louvre in Paris. But the rooms in Mantua, though now empty of their original treasures, remain a powerful testament to the vision of a woman who, in a world dominated by men, carved out a small space that was entirely her own and filled it with genius. Number 6. Why would a queen choose a monastery for her final home? She was one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England. She was the mother of 2 English kings. In her later years, she retired not to a comfortable palace, but to an abbey, a religious house that she had long supported. The abbey was Fontevraud Abbey in France. The queen was Eleanor of Aquitaine. For her, this was not a retreat from the world, but a new kind of power base, a spiritual and political center where she remained influential until the very end. Eleanor's life was long and turbulent. She inherited the vast and wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine in her own right. In 1137, she married the future King Louis VII of France. She was a vibrant and headstrong queen, and the marriage was not a happy one. She even accompanied him on the Second Crusade. The marriage was annulled in 1152. Just 8 weeks later, she married Henry, Duke of Normandy, who soon became King Henry II of England. Her marriage to Henry was passionate but stormy. They had 8 children, including Richard the Lionheart and King John. Eleanor was deeply involved in the politics of her husband's sprawling Angevin empire. But when she supported her sons in a revolt against their father in 1173, Henry had her imprisoned. She remained his prisoner for 16 years. She was only released after Henry's death in 1189, when her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, became king. Now in her late 60s, an age when most people were long retired, Eleanor entered the most powerful phase of her life. She ruled as regent, while Richard was away on the Third Crusade. She governed England, secured his ransom when he was captured, and put down a rebellion by her youngest son, John. Throughout her life, Eleanor had been a major patron of Fontevraud Abbey. It was a unique institution, a double monastery, with separate communities of monks and nuns, all under the authority of a powerful abbess. It was a place that offered women a rare opportunity for leadership and intellectual life. It was also the chosen burial place for her husband, Henry II, and her son, Richard. Around the year 1200, Eleanor, now nearly 80 years old, retired to Fontevraud. But this was not a quiet retirement. She did not become a nun. She lived in her own apartments within the abbey grounds and continued to be a political force. She advised her son King John, arranged diplomatic marriages for her granddaughters, and even led a small army to defend her lands. The abbey was her court, her administrative center, and her final sanctuary. She died at Fontevraud in 1204 at the age of about 82, an astonishing age for the time. She was buried in the abbey church next to her husband Henry and her son Richard. Her tomb effigy shows her lying on a bier, reading a book, a depiction of a cultured and powerful woman, serene and in control even in death. Eleanor of Aquitaine did not build Fontevraud, but she adopted it, enriched it, and made it her own. By choosing to live and be buried there, she transformed it into a royal necropolis for the Plantagenet dynasty. Her choice of a female-led institution for her final home speaks volumes about her own life as a woman who wielded immense power in a man's world. Number 5. How did a queen's dream house become a national treasure? She designed it with her husband. It was not a grand, formal palace, but a comfortable, modern family home by the sea. It was her private escape from the pressures of London and the first home she ever owned outright. The house is Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. The Queen was Queen Victoria. This house, built for her personal happiness, ended up shaping the way we think about family life, holidays, and even Christmas. Victoria became queen in 1837 at the age of 18. In 1840, she married her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Theirs was a deeply loving partnership. The royal couple and their growing family found the traditional royal residences like Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle to be too formal and lacking in privacy. They wanted a place of their own, away from the public eye. In 1845, they bought the Osborne estate on the Isle of Wight. The existing house was too small, so they decided to build a new one. Prince Albert, who had a passion for design and architecture, took the lead on the project, working closely with the London builder Thomas Cubitt. But the vision for the house was shared by both Victoria and Albert. They wanted an Italianate-style villa, inspired by the palaces they had seen in pictures of the Bay of Naples. The result was a house unlike any other royal residence. It was built on a human scale. The rooms were bright and airy, filled with comfortable furniture and family portraits. It was a home designed for a family, not for a court. It was also filled with the latest technology. It had a complex water and heating system, and even an early form of shower. The estate had its own private beach, where the queen and her children could swim and play. The children had their own miniature chalet, the Swiss cottage, where they learned to cook, garden, and keep house. Osborne was a carefully constructed ideal of domestic life. It was here that the royal family popularized many of the traditions we now associate with a family Christmas, like the Christmas tree, a tradition Albert brought from his native Germany. Victoria adored Osborne. She wrote in her diary, "It is impossible to imagine a prettier spot." She and Albert spent as much time there as they could, raising their 9 children. The house was a reflection of their personal tastes and their middle-class values of family, duty, and privacy. This happiness was shattered in 1861 when Prince Albert died of typhoid fever. Victoria was devastated. She entered a long period of mourning and withdrew from public life. Osborne House, which had been the symbol of her domestic bliss, became a shrine to her beloved husband. She preserved his rooms exactly as he had left them. She continued to spend a great deal of time at Osborne, finding comfort in the home they had created together. She built a new wing, the Durbar Wing, to display the gifts she received from India after she became Empress of India. But the house was always for her, Albert's house. Queen Victoria died at Osborne House on January 22nd, 1901. In her will, she left the house to the nation. She knew her children did not share her deep emotional attachment to it. She wanted it to be preserved as a memorial to Albert. Today, it is managed by English Heritage and is open to the public. Visitors can see the staterooms, but also the intensely private family rooms left almost exactly as they were in Victoria's time. It is a poignant and intimate glimpse into the private world of a queen who built a house for love, only to have it become her sanctuary of grief. Number 4, how can a palace built on stolen money become a national disgrace? She spent a fortune on it. The money was supposed to be used to build a modern navy for her country. Instead, she used it to rebuild her lavish private retreat, a vast complex of palaces, temples, and gardens. The retreat is the Summer Palace, or Yiheyuan in Beijing. The woman who built it was the Dowager Empress Cixi of China. Her indulgence became a symbol of the corruption and decay of the Qing dynasty as it faced increasing threats from foreign powers. Cixi was one of the most powerful women in Chinese history. She began her life in the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine to the Xianfeng Emperor. She rose to prominence by giving birth to his only son and heir. When the emperor died in 1861, her 5-year-old son became the Tongzi Emperor. Cixi, along with the empress consort, became co-regents, ruling from behind a silk screen. She would be the de facto ruler of China for nearly 50 years. The original summer palace, known as the Yuan, had been destroyed by British and French troops in 1860 during the Second Opium War. It was a national humiliation. Cixi dreamed of rebuilding it as a place to spend her retirement. In the 1880s, she began to divert huge sums of money from the state budget, particularly from funds allocated to the Imperial Navy. It's estimated that she spent around 30 million taels of silver on the project, money that was desperately needed to modernize China's defenses. She chose the site of the Garden of Clear Ripples, an existing imperial garden, and began a massive expansion and renovation. The result was the Yiheyuan, or Garden of Nurtured Harmony. The complex covers over 700 acres, with a large man-made lake, Kunming Lake, at its center. The earth dug out to create the lake was used to build Longevity Hill, which is crowned by a number of magnificent temples and pavilions. The palace is a masterpiece of Chinese landscape design, with beautiful gardens, ornate bridges, and covered walkways. The most famous of these is the Long Corridor, a covered walkway over 700 meters long, decorated with more than 14,000 paintings. The centerpiece of the lake is the infamous marble boat. Cixi had a stone pavilion built on the lake's edge in the shape of a paddle steamer, with a superstructure made of wood painted to look like marble. A famous saying at the time was that the money used to build this useless stone boat could have bought a real warship. Cixi officially retired to the Summer Palace in 1889, but she continued to rule from there. The palace was her personal paradise filled with treasures and luxuries. She had a theater for traditional opera performances, of which she was a huge fan. She would be carried around the gardens in a sedan chair. She spent her days surrounded by a court of fawning eunuchs and officials. The consequences of her extravagance were disastrous. In 1894, the First Sino-Japanese War broke out. The poorly equipped and poorly led Chinese Navy was decisively defeated by the modern Japanese fleet. Many blamed the defeat directly on Cixi and the money she had siphoned off to build her pleasure garden. The Summer Palace became a symbol of her selfishness and her disregard for the needs of the nation. In 1900, during the Boxer Rebellion, the palace was again damaged by foreign troops from the Eight-Nation Alliance. Cixi was forced to flee. She later returned and had it repaired. She died in 1908, leaving behind a dynasty on the brink of collapse. The Qing dynasty fell just 3 years later. Today, the Summer Palace is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of Beijing's most popular tourist attractions, a beautiful but troubling monument to a powerful woman whose personal desires helped to seal her empire's fate. Number 3. Did a queen's fantasy village cause a revolution? She wanted to play at being a peasant. In the gardens of her private palace, she had a fake rustic village built, complete with a working farm, a dairy, a mill, and a farmhouse. Here, she and her ladies-in-waiting would dress in simple muslin dresses and pretend to be milkmaids. The place was the Hameau de Lorraine, or the Queen's Hamlet, in the grounds of the Petit Trianon at Versailles. The Queen was Marie Antoinette. This innocent, if tone-deaf, fantasy became a symbol of her extravagance and her detachment from the suffering of the French people, and it helped fuel the revolutionary hatred against her. Marie Antoinette was an Austrian archduchess who married the future King Louis XVI of France when she was just 14. She found the rigid etiquette and constant public scrutiny of the French court at Versailles stifling. She longed for privacy and a simpler, more natural life. In 1774, her husband, now king, gave her the Petit Trianon, a small chateau in the park of Versailles, as her own private domain. No one, not even the king, could enter without her permission. The Petit Trianon became her sanctuary. She redecorated the chateau in the latest neoclassical style. She had an English-style landscape garden created with winding paths, a grotto, and a temple of love. But she wanted something more. Inspired by the fashionable philosophical ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who idealized the natural life of the peasantry, she decided to build her own picturesque hamlet. Between 1783 and 1787, the Queen's Hamlet was built to the designs of the architect Richard Meek. It consisted of a dozen buildings arranged around an artificial lake. The buildings were deliberately rustic on the outside, with thatched roofs and rough-hewn timbers, designed to look like a real Normandy village. But inside, the Queen's own house and the billiard room were furnished with elegant, sophisticated furniture. It was a fantasy, a stage set. The hamlet had a working farm with cows, sheep, and goats. The dairy was equipped with exquisite Sèvres porcelain milk pails. The Queen and her friends would gather here to watch the animals being milked and to sample fresh milk and cheese. They would fish in the lake and tend to the flower gardens. For Marie Antoinette, it was a release from the pressures of her role, a chance to create an idealized world where she could be herself. But outside the Golden Gates of Versailles, France was facing a severe economic crisis. There were bread shortages and widespread poverty. Rumors began to spread about the Queen's Hamlet. The stories became wildly exaggerated. People imagined that the walls were studded with diamonds and that the Queen was playing at being poor, while the real poor were starving. The hamlet became a potent symbol of the monarchy's wastefulness and its complete disconnect from the reality of most people's lives. The famous and almost certainly untrue quote, "Let them eat cake," was attributed to her, and the image of her playing milkmaid in her fantasy village seemed to prove it. When the French Revolution began in 1789, the Queen became a primary target of the revolutionaries' anger. She was vilified in pamphlets and cartoons. Her Austrian extravagance and her supposed indifference to the people were cited as reasons for the monarchy's corruption. The hamlet, her private attempt at a simple life, was used as a weapon against her. Marie Antoinette was executed by guillotine in 1793. The hamlet fell into disrepair during the Revolution. It was later restored and remains one of the most popular parts of the Versailles estate. It is a beautiful and charming place, but it is haunted by the tragic story of the Queen who built it. It is a monument to the dangerous gap that can open up between the gilded lives of rulers and the harsh realities of their people. Number 2, how did a German princess remake Russia in her own image? She was a minor German princess who came to Russia to marry the heir to the throne. She seized power from her own husband in a coup and went on to rule the vast Russian Empire for 34 years. She expanded her empire's borders, reformed its laws, and oversaw a golden age of arts and sciences. And she expressed her immense power and sophisticated taste through architecture, transforming a modest palace into a breathtaking monument to her own glory. The palace is Tsarskoye Selo, near St. Petersburg. The empress was Catherine the Great. Catherine arrived in Russia in 1744 as Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a name she soon shed. She was chosen to marry Grand Duke Peter, the heir of Empress Elizabeth. The marriage was a disaster. Peter was immature and cruel. Catherine, meanwhile, was intelligent and ambitious. She learned Russian, converted to the Orthodox faith, and carefully cultivated powerful allies at court. When Empress Elizabeth died in 1761, Peter became Emperor Peter III. He was deeply unpopular. After just 6 months on the throne, Catherine, with the support of the imperial guards, overthrew him. He was arrested and died shortly after, likely murdered. Catherine was proclaimed Empress of all Russia. As Empress, Catherine was a prolific builder. One of her favorite residences was Tsarskoye Selo, the Tsar's village. The main palace there had been built by her predecessor, Empress Elizabeth, in a lavish, gilded Rococo style. Catherine found it old-fashioned. While she kept the spectacular exterior, she decided to completely remodel the interiors to reflect her own neoclassical tastes. She wanted something more restrained, more elegant, more in line with the Enlightenment ideals she admired. Starting in the 1770s, she hired the Scottish architect Charles Cameron. Cameron was an expert on classical Roman architecture. For Catherine, he created a suite of new apartments in a wing of the palace. These rooms were a revelation. The green dining room, the blue drawing room, and the exquisite agate rooms were masterpieces of neoclassical design, with walls of jasper and porphyry, delicate stucco work, and inlaid floors. They were inspired by ancient Roman villas and were completely different from the gold-encrusted rooms of the rest of the palace. Catherine also added a number of new buildings to the vast park surrounding the palace. She had Cameron build the Cameron Gallery, an elegant classical colonnade where she could walk and discuss philosophy with her friends. She had a Chinese village and a Turkish bath built, reflecting her interest in exotic cultures. The park was filled with bridges, pavilions, and monuments celebrating her military victories, particularly against the Ottoman Empire. Tsarskoye Selo was Catherine's personal project. It was her laboratory for new ideas in architecture and landscape design. It was where she could express her identity as an enlightened modern monarch. It was a physical manifestation of the new Europeanized Russia she was trying to build. One of the most famous parts of the palace was the Amber Room, a room with walls made entirely of intricately carved amber panels. It was a gift from the King of Prussia to Peter the Great. It was moved to Catherine's palace by Empress Elizabeth. Although Catherine did not create it, it became one of the wonders of her residence. The palace was used by the Tsars until the Russian Revolution in 1917. During World War II, it was occupied by German forces. They stripped the palace of its treasures, including the entire Amber Room, which was dismantled and shipped away. It has never been seen again. After the war, the Soviet government began the long and painstaking process of restoring the palace to its former glory. A new Amber Room, based on old photographs, was created and opened in 2003. Today, the palace at Tsarskoye Selo is a museum. It is a stunning monument to the power and taste of the empresses who built it. But it is Catherine's classical interiors and her landscaped park that truly show the mind of the woman who considered herself a philosopher on the throne, a German princess who remade Russia in her own image. Number 1. Why did a queen build a palace for a king who never came? She built it for her king and husband, a man who never once set foot in it. The palace was designed to be his official residence, a grand statement of his power. But he hated the country and its people and refused to live there. So the queen lived there alone, ruling in his name. The palace is the Royal Palace of Amsterdam. The queen was Hortense de Beauharnais, Queen of Holland. The palace she occupied was a symbol of a kingdom that was imposed by a foreign power and a marriage that was a political sham. But Hortense was the daughter of Josephine de Beauharnais. When her mother married Napoleon Bonaparte, Hortense became his stepdaughter. Napoleon was very fond of her. To secure his political alliances, he arranged for her to marry his younger brother, Louis Bonaparte, in 1802. The marriage was loveless and unhappy from the start. Hortense was lively and social Louis was melancholic, jealous, and suffered from poor health. In 1806, Napoleon established the Kingdom of Holland and made his brother Louis the king. Hortense became the queen. The couple moved to the Netherlands, a country they knew little about. Louis took his role as king seriously. He tried to learn Dutch and to rule for the benefit of his new subjects. He was known as Good King Louis, but he disliked the damp climate and the formal court life. The city of Amsterdam was made the new capital. The massive 17th century town hall on Dam Square was chosen to be the new royal palace. It was a magnificent building, a symbol of the city's golden age wealth. But it was an administrative building, not a home. Between 1806 and 1808, it was extensively remodeled to serve as a royal residence. Hortense, with her refined French taste, likely had some influence on the new decorations. The grand rooms were filled with magnificent Empire-style furniture, much of it made by the finest Parisian craftsmen. The style was a dramatic contrast to the severe classical exterior of the building. The palace was meant to be a showcase for the new Bonapartist monarchy. But King Louis never liked it. He found the palace in the city of Amsterdam to be gloomy and unhealthy. He preferred to live in smaller residences in other cities, like Utrecht or Haarlem. He and Hortense lived mostly separate lives. And Hortense, however, often stayed at the royal palace in Amsterdam. It was the official center of the kingdom, and as queen, she was expected to host receptions and court events there. She lived in the Grand Palace, surrounded by luxury, but essentially alone, representing a king who was never there. The Kingdom of Holland was short-lived. Louis Bonaparte increasingly clashed with his powerful brother. He tried to put Dutch interests ahead of French ones, which angered Napoleon. In 1810, Napoleon forced Louis to abdicate and annexed the Netherlands directly into the French Empire. Hortense left the country. She would never return. After Napoleon's final defeat in 1815, the Netherlands became a monarchy again under the House of Orange. The former town hall was given back to the city, but eventually became the official reception palace for the Dutch royal family, a role it still serves today. The magnificent collection of empire furniture from King Louis and Queen Hortense's time is still there, a unique and perfectly preserved time capsule. The Royal Palace of Amsterdam tells a strange story. It was a palace transformed for a queen who did not want to be there in a country that was not her own, for a king who refused to live in it. It is a monument to a forced marriage and a failed political experiment, a lavish home that was never really a home for anyone.